The gallows stood skeletal against the bleeding dawn, ropes swaying like a serpent tasting the bone-dry air. Below, Eliza Dawn trembled, her silence louder than the jeering crowd. Then, a shadow split the horizon, a lone rider, feathers stark against the rising sun. He halted before the hanging judge. "This death is wrong," the Comanche warrior declared, his voice cutting the desert stillness. "I invoke the trial of the winds." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. Bitter Creek huddled in the vast, indifferent embrace of the New Mexico desert, 1878. It was less a town than a scar on the ochre earth, a collection of sun-bleached adobe buildings and warped timber structures huddled around a single dust-choked street that vanished into the shimmering haze. The air itself felt heavy, laden with the scent of sagebrush, hot stone, and the iron tang of fear that had settled over the place like a shroud. At its heart, dominating the wretched square, stood the gallows, raw, new timber smelling faintly of pine sap, a stark and brutal punctuation mark in the dusty sentence of the town. Today, it demanded a full stop. Eliza Dawn stood upon its rough-hewn platform, her slight frame dwarfed by the looming structure. 18 summers had etched delicate lines of hardship onto a face that should have known only youth. Her hands, bound cruelly tight before her, were raw and bruised, the knuckles scraped. The simple calico dress she wore was torn to shoulder, revealing a livid bruise beneath the grime. Her eyes, the startling gray of monsoon clouds gathering over distant mesas, held no tears. They stared out, unfocused, past the sea of hostile faces below, miners with grit-etched features, shopkeepers clutching their aprons, women whispering behind hands, children peering with morbid curiosity. Her silence was profound, a fortress built of shock and a terror too deep for screams. It was a silence the town of Bitter Creek had interpreted as guilt. The charge was murder. The victim, Silas Croft, a rancher whose sprawling Barcee spread gobbled-up land and water rights like a ravenous beast. Croft was a man who wielded power like a bullwhip, brutal, unpredictable, and unquestioned by the likes of Judge Harlan Voss, who now adjusted his spectacles on the podium beside the gallows. Croft had been found 3 days prior in his study, a single, vicious knife wound to the heart. And Eliza, a drifter girl who'd arrived mere weeks before, seeking shelter and meager work at the cantina, had been discovered nearby, blood smeared on her skirt. Croft's ornate silver money clip clutched in her frozen hand. No weapon was found. Her protestations, whispered at first, then screamed in the face of the sheriff's rough handling, had dissolved into this chilling, vacant silence. Judge Voss, a man whose jowls seemed perpetually flushed with self-importance and cheap whiskey, cleared his throat. His black robe looked absurdly formal against the bleached backdrop of the desert town. "Eliza Dawn," his voice rasped, carrying easily in a hushed square, "you stand convicted by a jury of your peers for foul murder of Silas Croft, a pillar of this community. The sentence is death by hanging. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court finds none." A murmur, half approval, half apprehension, rippled through the crowd. Mercy was a scarce commodity in Bitter Creek, especially for an outsider, a girl with no kin, no history, no one to speak for her. Her only defender, a weary, drink-sodden lawyer appointed by Voss, had barely raised a whisper in her defense, overwhelmed by the circumstantial tide and the judge's steely glare. "Sheriff," Voss intoned, his gaze cold and final, "carry out the sentence." The sheriff, a thick-set man named Briggs with eyes like chips of flint, stepped forward, his boots heavy on the platform. He adjusted the coarse noose. Eliza flinched as the hemp scraped her neck, a tiny, involuntary spasm, the only crack in her stoic facade. The desert wind, a constant presence, chose that moment to rise, whistling to the gallows timbers, carrying grains of sand that stung exposed skin. It sounded like a mournful sigh. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was distant at first, rhythmic, almost lost beneath the wind. Then it grew louder, distinct. The steady drumbeat of unshod hooves on hard-packed earth. Heads turned, squinting against the low, blinding sun rising directly east along the street. A figure emerged in the glare, resolving slowly into sharp relief. A horse, lean and powerful, the color of burnt sienna. Upon it sat a man like carved obsidian. His face was impassive, weathered by sun and wind into stern, unyielding lines. His hair, black as a raven's wing, was braided with leather and adorned with two eagle feathers that stood defiantly upright. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, trousers, and high moccasins. A rifle lay across his lap. A bone-handled knife rested at his hip. His eyes, dark and fathomless, scanned the scene before him. The crowd, the sheriff, the judge, the girl with a noose at her throat, with an unsettling stillness that radiated ancient authority. He rode directly to the foot of the gallows platform, his horse stopping mere feet from the steps. The silence now was absolute, thick with tension and disbelief. No Comanche ventured willingly into Bitter Creek. Stories of raids, of brutal reprisals, hung heavy in collective memory. His presence was an earthquake in the fragile order of the town. Judge Voss recovered first, puffing out his chest. "You, savage, this is a lawful execution. Begone or face arrest." The warrior ignored him, his gaze locked onto Eliza. For a fleeting instant, something flickered in those dark eyes. Recognition? Sorrow? It vanished as quickly as it came. Then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant, carrying effortlessly without seeming to shout. It was a voice accustomed to vast spaces and commanding attention. "This death is wrong." The words hung in the air, stark and undeniable. The wind carries no guilt from her, only fear and lies. He gestured vaguely toward the crowd, a sweep of his hand that seemed to encompass the entire town's complicity. Voss sputtered. "Preposterous. The law has spoken. The evidence." "The white man's law," the warrior interrupted, his tone glacial, his blind to the truth whispered on the desert wind. "I am Iron Shadow of the Quahati Band. I invoke Numu Tekwapu, the trial of the three winds. For this one," he pointed a callous finger directly at Eliza. A collective gasp went up. Whispers hissed through the crowd like startled rattlesnakes. "Trial of the winds? Heathen nonsense. What does a savage want?" Iron Shadow's gaze never left Voss, though it seemed to pierce right through him. 3 days, he stated, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of those closest. 3 trials, spoken by the wind itself. If she endures, the winds proclaim her innocence. Your law must yield to the older law. Judge Voss's face purpled. "Outrageous. We do not bow to savage rituals. Sheriff, remove this." "Judge Voss." The voice was quiet, strained, coming from beside the podium. Widow Martha Claiborne, the gaunt, gray-haired woman who ran the town's only boarding house and occasionally assisted the absent preacher, stepped forward. Her hands twisted in her faded shawl, but her eyes met the judge's. "Silas Croft, he wasn't universally loved," she ventured, her voice trembling but clear. "And the knife, they never found the knife that killed him. Isn't that significant? Perhaps a delay? To hear." She trailed off under Voss's withering glare, but the seed of doubt, however small, was sown. Iron Shadow saw it. He pressed his advantage, his voice dropping even lower, meant only for Voss the sheriff, and perhaps Eliza straining to hear above her own pounding heart. "The man you found dead," Iron Shadow murmured, the words carrying an unnerving weight. "He carried a secret that burns hotter than this desert sun. A secret known to the rocks, the scorpion, and to me. Deny the trial, and that secret becomes a wildfire. Burn you." Voss froze. His eyes, wide with sudden, uncharacteristic fear, darted from Iron Shadow's implacable face to the bewildered crowd, then to Eliza, a mere wisp of a girl facing annihilation. The blood drained from his jowls, leaving them a sickly gray. The threat, cryptic but potent, hung heavier than the noose. He remembered Croft's recent, furtive dealings, the unexplained gold, the rider seen under moonlight heading towards Comanche. Fear, cold and calculating, warred with his bluster. 3 days. Voss choked out, the words tasting like ash. 3 days only. No tricks, savage. The girl remains in the sheriff's custody, and if your winds fail her, she hangs at dawn on the 4th day. He slammed his gavel down on the podium, a hollow, impotent sound. Court adjourned. Chaos erupted. The crowd surged, voices raised in anger, confusion, and morbid fascination. Sheriff Briggs, looking profoundly uneasy, roughly pulled Eliza back from the noose, the hemp scraping her neck raw. She stumbled, her gray eyes finally focusing, locking onto Iron Shadow. He sat immobile on his horse, a statue carved from the desert itself. His gaze met hers across the tumult. There was no warmth there, no easy reassurance, only a fierce, unwavering intensity. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't comfort, it was a challenge accepted, a pact sealed in the shadow of the gallows. As Briggs hauled Eliza towards the squat, stone jailhouse, Iron Shadow turned his horse. He didn't look back at the spluttering judge or the agitated townsfolk. His eyes scanned a vast, unforgiving expanse beyond Bitter Creek, the ragged cliffs, the endless stretches of creosote and cholla, the distant, purple hump of the mesa. The wind picked up again, swirling dust devils in the square, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something ancient and watchful. The first wind comes of the setting sun. Iron Shadow spoke, his voice carrying clearly over the wind, though he seemed to address the desert itself. It speaks of what was hidden. It remembers the blood that cries from the earth. He looked towards the jail, where Eliza had just disappeared into the gloom, and it has teeth. He nudged his horse, moving not toward the town's meager lodgings, but toward the outskirts, seeking the high ground. The trial had begun. The desert held its breath, waiting for the first wind to rise. The jail cell in Bitter Creek wasn't built for comfort. It was built for despair. Thick adobe walls drank the light, leaving only a single barred window high up, casting a weak parallelogram of dusty sun onto the packed earth floor. Eliza sat on a rough cot, her bound hands resting in her lap. The scrape of the noose still burned her neck, a phantom echo of the horror she'd narrowly escaped. Iron Shadow's intervention hadn't brought peace, only a different kind of terror. The terror of the unknown, of ancient rituals whispered about in fearful tones beyond her cell door. Sheriff Briggs, his face a mask of uneasy duty, had shoved a tin cup of water and hardtack through the bars. "Don't get comfortable, girl," he grunted. 3 days. Then it's back up them steps. His eyes hadn't quite met hers. The Comanche's cryptic threat to Voss had unsettled the foundations of the sheriff's simple world. Alone, the silence pressed in, heavier than the adobe. It wasn't the silence of guilt the town imagined. It was the silence of a well-run dry. The shock of finding Croft, the blood, the rough hands grabbing her, the accusations raining down like stones had sealed her voice shut. Words felt like shards of glass in her throat. Now, amidst this new dread, fragments surfaced not of the murder, but before. The rhythmic clatter of a stagecoach wheel. Her father's voice, low and warm, telling tales of consolations. Her mother's hand, cool on a fevered brow. Then, the jarring halt, the shouts, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the terrifying silence afterwards. Orphaned adrift, ending up in Bitter Creek, because the stagecoach stopped here, and there was nowhere else. She'd taken work at the cantina, scrubbing floors, trying to vanish, until Silas Croft's leering gaze had found her. A shadow fell across the weak sunlight in her cell. Eliza flinched, expecting Briggs. Instead, Iron Shadow stood framed in the corridor outside the bars. He moved with a silence that defied his size. Up close, the lines on his face were like a map of the desert itself. Canyons of endurance etched by sun and sorrow. His dark eyes held hers, not with pity, but with an assessment as sharp as flint. He held a single object through the bars, a hawk feather, pristine and tawny, its tip edged in black. The first wind comes at sundown, he stated, his voice low but resonant in a confined space. It speaks of what was hidden. It remembers. You will walk the path of whispers. He extended the feather. Hold this. Do not let the wind take it until you reach the speaking stone. If it flies before then, the wind judges you false. If you hold it, you pass its test. The path is narrow. He didn't elaborate on the consequences of failure. He didn't need to. The gallows waited. Eliza stared at the feather, a symbol of freedom that felt like an impossible burden. Her hands, still raw from the ropes, trembled. Could she even grasp it? Could she walk a path Iron Shadow deemed narrow, under a judging wind, with the eyes of a hostile town upon her? A spark, faint but stubborn, flickered deep within her exhaustion. Not like this. Not silent and broken. She reached through the bars. Her fingers brushed the soft veins of the feather, then closed around the stiff quill. It felt surprisingly light, yet charged with significance. The setting sun transformed the desert west of Bitter Creek into a forge of molten copper and bruised purple. A reluctant crowd, perhaps 24 strong, had gathered at Iron Shadow's command on a high, wind-scoured ridge overlooking a deep, shadow-filled canyon. Judge Voss stood apart, his face sour, flanked by Sheriff Briggs and a few hard-faced ranch hands loyal to Croft memory, or more likely, his remaining power. Widow Claiborne stood near the front, wringing her hands, her gaze darting between Eliza and the terrifying drop. Others clustered nervously, miners smelling of dust and sweat. Shopkeepers looking uncomfortable, a few women clutching shawls against the rising evening chill and the strangeness of it all. A young boy, maybe 10, with wide, curious eyes, peeked from behind his mother's skirts, fascinated by the imposing Comanche. "The savage circus begins," muttered Jed Carter, a grizzled miner, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the rocks. "Waste a good sunset watching." "Hush, Jed," Martha Claiborne murmured, though her voice held little conviction. "If there's doubt." "Doubt." Carter scoffed. Girl was caught red-handed. Literally. Heathen mumbo-jumbo won't change that. Iron Shadow ignored them. He stood near the edge of the ridge where a natural path, barely wider than a man's shoulders, snaked along a sheer cliff face before disappearing around a rocky outcrop. At the outcrop's furthest point, silhouetted against the dying sun, stood a solitary pillar of wind-carved sandstone, the speaking stone. The wind, a constant presence, was stronger here, keening as it tore through the canyon below, whipping dust and grit. It carried the scent of ozone, sage, and the profound emptiness of the abyss. He turned to Eliza, brought up from the jail by Briggs. She looked impossibly small and fragile against the vast, brutal landscape, the hawk feather clutched tight in her trembling fist. Her gray eyes were huge, reflecting the fiery sky, filled with terror that threatened to paralyze her. Iron Shadow's gaze held hers. He didn't speak encouragement. Instead, he placed a hand briefly, firmly on her shoulder. The touch was grounding, surprisingly warm. A memory, sharp and unexpected, pierced her fear, not of him, but a similar touch years ago, during a terrifying river crossing, a strong hand guiding her small one. A stranger? The fleeting image vanished, leaving only the solid pressure of his hand and the terrifying path ahead. "Walk," Iron Shadow commanded, his voice cutting to the wind's moan. The first wind listens. It knows the truth in your spirit. Hold the feather. Reach the stone. Eliza took a shuddering breath. The wind tugged at her dress, her hair, the precious feather. One misstep, one gust too strong, and she would plummet into the shadowy maw of the canyon. She focused on the speaking stone, a dark sentinel against the blaze of sunset, one foot in front of the other. The path was uneven, littered with loose scree. The wind buffeted her, a living thing pushing against her small frame, whispering secrets she couldn't understand. "Lies," Iron Shadow had said. The wind carried lies, or sought to blow them away. Below, the crowd watched, a mix of skepticism and morbid fascination etched on their faces. Voss shifted impatiently. Briggs chewed his lip, hand resting uneasily on his pistol grip. The young boy, Ben, tugged his mother's arm. "Ma, is the wind really talking?" "Hush, child," she whispered, pulling him closer, her own eyes wide. Eliza inched forward. The path narrowed further. A particularly fierce gust slammed into her, tearing at the feather, threatening to rip it from her grasp and her off the ledge. She cried out, a sound swallowed by the wind, staggering sideways. Her foot slipped on loose gravel. A collective gasp rose from a ridge. She windmilled her free arm, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. For a split second, she teetered on the edge, staring down into the deepening shadows. Father, mother, the feather, held in a death grip, pointed defiantly skyward. Iron's shadow hadn't moved, but his entire body was coiled tension, watching her every step, every sway. His expression remained unreadable, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his own forearm. Somehow, Eliza found purchase. She dug her worn boot heel into the rock, pushed back, and regained her balance. The feather remained clenched in her fist. Tears born of terror and sheer exertion streamed down her face, instantly dried by the wind. She didn't look back. She fixed her eyes on the speaking stone and pushed forward, step by agonizing step. The wind roared in her ears, a cacophony that felt strangely personal, as if testing her resolve, scraping away the layers of shock and fear to see what lay beneath. The final yards were the longest. The path widened slightly near the stone, but the wind funneled fiercely around the outcrop. Grit stung her eyes. She stumbled the last few steps and collapsed against the rough, sun-warmed surface of the speaking stone. She pressed her forehead to the ancient rock, gasping, her whole body trembling violently. Slowly, deliberately, she raised a hand clutching the hawk feather. It trembled, but she held it aloft, offering it back to the wind that had tried so hard to take it. A sudden, powerful gust whipped around the stone. It snatched at the feather, plucking it cleanly from her grasp. Eliza froze, a new wave of icy dread washing over her. Had it been too soon? Had she failed? But the feather didn't plummet into the canyon. Instead, the wind lifted it high, dancing with it, spinning it in a graceful, ascending spiral against the crimson and gold sky. It rose higher and higher, a tiny, defiant speck of life against the immensity, until it was lost in the fiery brilliance of the setting sun. A profound silence fell, deeper than before, even the wind seeming to hold its breath. The crowd on the ridge watched, stunned. Even Jed Carter's scoff died on his lips. Widow Claiborne made a small, choked sound, perhaps of wonder. Iron Shadow stood tall on the ridge. "The first wind has spoken," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "It has taken the truth offered. It finds no guilt in her spirit for the blood spilled." His gaze swept over the crowd, lingering for a fraction of a second on Judge Voss's ashen face. But it remembers all blood, and the secrets buried with it. Eliza, slumped against the speaking stone, felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it threatened to pull her under. She had survived the first wind, but as she looked back towards the ridge, towards Iron Shadow's implacable figure and the town's bewildered faces, she saw no relief in his eyes, only a deeper gravity. "The second wind comes with the moon zenith," Iron Shadow declared, his voice dropping to a low, ominous timbre that sent shivers down spines despite the lingering desert heat. "It speaks of the hand that held the knife. It seeks the shadow that hides from the light." He looked directly at Eliza, his expression unreadable in the gathering twilight. "Rest, little sparrow. The next wind." He paused, letting the words hang heavy in the cooling air. "Hunts liars." The jail cell felt colder after sundown, the adobe leaching the day's meager warmth into the encroaching desert night. Eliza sat hunched on the cot, the raw scrape on her neck a dull throb beneath the rough collar of her dress. The memory of the cliff path, the howling wind trying to steal the feather in her life, was etched onto her bones. Exhaustion wore with strange, fragile thrumming in her chest. She had faced the abyss, and the first wind had spoken for her. not with words, but with the feather's defiant flight. It was a sliver of validation in a world determined to crush her. Yet, Iron Shadow's final words echoed louder than the settling desert silence. The next wind hunts liars. Fear, cold and serpentine, coiled in her stomach. What lies? Whose lies? She hugged her knees, the silence within her a prison far more confining than the adobe walls. Could the wind truly hunt the darkness hiding the real killer? Could it reach into the black heart of Bitter Creek? The scrape of the jail's outer door broke the quiet. Heavy footsteps approached. Sheriff Briggs, likely, but the shadow that fell across her cell bars was taller, broader. Iron Shadow stood silently, his features stark in the lantern light Briggs held uneasily behind him. In his hands, he cradled a smooth, dark river stone, large as a man's fist, its surface polished by centuries of water, now dry. Etched onto its face were intricate, swirling lines, ancient symbols whispering of time beyond the town's short, brutal history. "The second wind rises," Iron Shadow stated, his voice a low rumble in a confined space. He extended the stone through the bars. "At the moon's highest point, you will sit within the circle of asking. Hold this Pia stone. Place your hand upon it. The wind that hunts liars will come. It will seek the shadow clinging to the truth of Silas Croft's death." His dark eyes held hers, intense, searching. "It will try to frighten you. It may show you things buried deep. Hold the stone. Do not let fear make you drop it. The stone is truth. It endures. If you release it, the wind claims you false." Eliza stared at the etched stone. It looked heavy, solid, a tangible anchor against a terrifying unknown. Her voice, buried so deep, strained against the silence. A sound, barely a whisper, escaped her lips, a choked gasp, not a word, but the ghost of one. Iron Shadow's gaze sharpened, a flicker of something crossing his impassive face. Recognition? Encouragement? He merely nodded once, a gesture as weighty as the stone itself. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface before closing around it. It was surprisingly dense, radiating a quiet, ancient strength. The moon, a cold, brilliant hunter's orb, cast the desert in silver and sharp-edged shadow. The chosen site was a natural amphitheater half a mile north of Bitter Creek, hidden within low, crumbling bluffs. At its center stood a circle of weathered sandstone monoliths, their surfaces scarred by wind and time, some bearing faded petroglyphs, spirals, handprints, figures dancing under ancient stars. The circle of asking. The moonlight spilled over the stones like liquid mercury, making the etched symbol seem to writhe and whisper. A smaller, more apprehensive crowd gathered at the edge of the circle. Kept back by an invisible line Iron Shadow seemed to command with his presence. Judge Voss stood rigid, his face pale and sweaty in the moonlight. Sheriff Briggs hovering close. Jed Carter muttered darkly to another miner, but even his skepticism seemed muted by the eerie grandeur of the place. Widow Martha Claiborne clutched her shawl tightly, her eyes wide with a mixture of dread and burgeoning hope. Young Ben pressed against her side, his earlier fascination replaced by wide-eyed awe at the moonlit stones. A new figure lingered near the back. Abner Finch, Croft's gaunt, perpetually nervous bookkeeper, wringing his hands, his eyes darting nervously from the stones to Voss and back. Iron Shadow led Eliza into the center of the circle. The desert night air was crisp, carrying the distant yip of a coyote and the dry rustle of sage. The silence here was different from the jail, vast, watchful, charged with expectancy. He gestured to a flat rock nestled between two larger monoliths. "Sit. Hold the Pia stone. Place your hand upon its face. Face the moon." His instructions were simple, devoid of comfort. The wind comes. It hunts. Remember, the stone endures. Eliza sat, the cold rock seeping through her thin dress. She cradled a heavy-edged stone in her lap, then, taking a shuddering breath, placed her right palm flat against its smooth, cool surface. The ancient symbols pressed into her skin. She tilted her face up to the blinding silver disk of the moon. The vastness of the sky, the silent sentinels of stone, made her feel infinitesimally small. Hunt's liars. The phrase echoed in her mind. A low moan began on the desert floor, gathering strength as it swirled around the circle. The second wind. It wasn't a roaring gale to cliff. This was a colder, sharper wind, whispering, probing, slithering between the stones like an invisible serpent. It lifted the fine hairs on Eliza's arms, snaked down her collar, carrying a scent of dust, ice, and something else, something metallic and old, like dry blood. The wind's whisper intensified, becoming voices, not words but sensations, anger, greed, a sharp, sudden fear. Eliza gasped. Images flickered behind her closed eyelids, disjointed, terrifying. Silas Croft's florid face, contorted not in death throes, but in furious, whispered argument with a shadowy figure near the livery stable. The glint of a distinctive rifle, a Winchester with a silver inlay on the stock, being exchanged hastily, furtively. Then, a sensation of cold steel in her own hand, the shocking warmth of blood, a cry that wasn't hers. No, she tried to pull away, but the stone held her hand fast, its cool solidity a tether against the onslaught. The wind shrieked around her, a chorus of accusations and hidden terrors. It seemed to coil around her throat, trying to steal her breath, whispering guilty. Liar. Her body trembled violently. She wanted to scream, to fling the stone away, to escape the horrifying visions. Tears streamed down her face, freezing in the wind. She focused on the stone, on the solid reality beneath her palm, the enduring truth of the symbols. Endure, like the stone. A particularly vicious gust tore at her, icy fingers trying to pry her hand loose. She cried out a raw, guttural sound, not a word but pure animal terror. Her grip on the P.S. stone slipped fractionally. On the edge of the circle, Widow Martha gasped. Jed Carter spat. Abner Finch took a half-step back, his face ashen, muttering, "The rifle, oh Lord, the rifle," loud enough for those nearby to hear. Judge Voss whirled on him, his eyes blazing with panic. "Shut your mouth, Finch." Iron Shadow stood immobile, a statue carved from moonlight and shadow, his gaze fixed on Eliza. His jaw was clenched, every muscle taut. He didn't interfere. This was her trial. Eliza fought. She dug her nails into the unyielding stone, pressing her palm harder against the etched symbols. Not me, not my hand. The wind showed her another fleeting image, a woman with kind eyes and braided hair, smiling, offering water from a gourd to a younger Iron Shadow, his arm bandaged. Mother? The connection flared, her mother's face, blurred by time and grief, overlapping with a Comanche woman. A surge of strength, born of that fragmented memory, surged through her. She tightened her grip, anchoring herself against the wind's assault. The terrifying visions receded, replaced by a profound, vibrating silence emanating from the stone itself. The wind shrieked softened to a frustrated sigh, then stilled. Eliza slumped forward, gasping, her hand still welded to the Pia stone. It felt warm now, pulsing faintly against her palm. She had held on. A profound quiet descended, deeper than before. The moon bathed the circle in its cold light. Iron Shadow stepped forward. "The second wind has hunted," he announced, his voice cutting through the stillness. He looked not at the crowd, but at the trembling girl clutching the stone. "It found no lie in your heart, little sparrow." His gaze then swept over the crowd, lingering on the terrified Abner Finch and the apoplectic Judge Voss. But it scented its prey. It knows the shadow that held the knife. It knows the lies that walk among you. Eliza slowly, shakily, lifted her head. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the moonlight, met Iron Shadow's. The stone's warmth seemed to flow up her arm, unlocking something deep within the frozen well of her silence. Her lips moved. A single, cracked, barely audible word rasped out into the stunned night air. "Father." Before Iron Shadow could react, Before the murmurs of shock from the crowd could fully form, a violent gust of wind, hot and gritty and smelling of distant rain, roared across the desert, whipping sand and stinging eyes. It tore at clothes, sent hats flying, and momentarily blotted out the moon. Iron Shadow looked up, not at the sky, but towards the distant black silhouette of the mesa. "The third wind gathers," he said, his voice grave, carrying an edge of warning sharper than any knife. "The wind of reckoning. It does not test. It does not hunt. It answers, and it rides on storm." The word hung in the desert air long after the hot, grit-laden gust subsided. "Father." It echoed in the stunned silence of the stone circle, a fragile sound that had carried the weight of mountains. Eliza trembled, not just from the lingering chill of the second wind's hunt, but from the seismic shift within her. The Pia stone still pulsed faintly against her palm, a grounding warmth that felt like the first ember of a long-dead fire. Iron Shadow's gaze, when she dared to meet it, held a profound, unreadable intensity. Recognition, sorrow, a flicker of something akin to kinship. The crowd murmured, a hive of confusion and unease. Widow Martha Claiborne pressed a hand to her heart, tears glistening in the moonlight. Young Ben tugged her skirt, whispering, "She talked, Ma, she talked." Jed Carter scowled, kicking at the dirt. One word don't change nothing. Heathen magic. But his bluster lacked its usual conviction. Abner Finch, Croft's bookkeeper, looked like a man who'd seen a ghost, his eyes darting frantically between Judge Voss's thunderous expression and Iron Shadow's imposing figure. Voss himself was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the night chill. He rounded on Finch, his voice a venomous hiss. "You, rambling about rifles. Shut your fool mouth or you'll swing beside her." Sheriff Briggs stepped forward, his hand hovering near his pistol, his face a mask of conflicted duty. "Judge, maybe we oughta—" "Silence!" Voss roared, spittle flying. "The savage's tricks are almost done. One more wind, then justice." He glared at Iron Shadow. "Get on with your pagan spectacle. Comanche, where is this wind of reckoning?" Iron Shadow ignored him. His gaze remained fixed on Eliza. He stepped into the circle and gently, but firmly, pried the Pia stone from her grasp. The connection broke, leaving her feeling momentarily adrift, but the ember within her glowed a little brighter. He offered her a hand. After a heartbeat, Eliza placed her trembling, cold fingers in his. His grip was strong, calloused, and strangely reassuring as he helped her stand. He didn't speak, but his eyes held a silent question. She met his gaze, and in the gray depths of her own, something shifted, a spark of defiance, a fragile resolve. She gave the smallest nod. He released her hand and turned toward the dark silhouette of Thunder Mesa, looming like a brooding giant against the star-strewn sky. To the west, the horizon flickered with silent lightning, illuminating the bellies of vast, churning storm clouds rolling toward Bitter Creek like an avenging army. "The wind of reckoning gathers its strength," Iron Shadow announced, his voice resonating with the approaching storm's rumble. "It answers the cries of buried truth. It comes to the high place." He gestured towards a mesa. At its peak, where the lightning walks and the old spirits listen, the final wind will speak. He turned back to Eliza, reaching into a small pouch at his belt. He withdrew a simple object, a braided leather cord, intricately woven with beads of turquoise and bone, ending in a small, smooth obsidian stone. "This is tupu," he said, placing it around her neck. The obsidian felt cool against her skin, the braided leather surprisingly soft. "The binding truth. Wear it. Stand facing the storm's heart when the wind rises. Do not hide. Do not flinch. The reckoning wind will show what must be seen. It will demand the truth be spoken, not by the wind, but by you." Eliza's fingers closed around the obsidian pendant. "Spoken by you." The word sent a fresh wave of terror through her, but intertwined with it was a burgeoning sense of purpose. The silence that had been her prison now felt like a suffocating weight she desperately needed to shed. As Iron Shadow guided her towards the base of the mesa, the crowd followed, a tense, murmuring procession under the increasingly erratic flashes of lightning. The air grew thick, charged with ozone and the promise of violence. The scent of rain on parched earth, a rare and potent perfume, mingled with the dust kicked up by nervous feet. The ascent up thunder, mesa was treacherous in the gathering dark. Jagged rocks clawed at Eliza's dress and worn boots. Iron Shadow moved ahead, sure-footed as a mountain lion, occasionally reaching back to steady her on a steep incline. The wind was rising, no longer probing or hunting, but gathering power, howling around a mesa's flanks like a pack of wolves. Below, the flickering lanterns of Bitter Creek looked like fallen stars, insignificant against a vast, storm-lashed desert. Halfway up, sheltered momentarily by an overhang, Iron Shadow paused. Below, the townsfolk struggled on the lower slopes, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies. He turned to Eliza, his face etched in the stark light of a nearby lightning flash. "Your father," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the wind's howl, but piercing her soul. "Thomas Dawn. He pulled my sister, Little Willow, from the flooding Pecos River when the Bluecoats fired on our crossing. Your mother, Sarah, bound her wound. They gave us food, shelter in a hidden cave for one night." His dark eyes held hers, filled with an ancient sorrow. "They were good hearts in a bad time. I saw the fire wagon tracks weeks later. Found only silence. I vowed to the spirits that if any seed of theirs lived, I would be their shadow." He touched the braided cord around her neck. "Now, little sparrow, you must speak the truth the wind reveals. For them, for you." Memory struck Eliza like a physical blow, not just the fragmented images in the trial, but a vivid sensory flood. The terrifying roar of water, the sting of rain, her mother's terrified face illuminated by lightning, her father's strong arms pulling a dark-haired girl from the churning brown water, the girl's wide, frightened eyes that held the same fierce intensity as Iron Shadow's. Little Willow, the connection solidified, a lost piece of her shattered past clicking into place. Tears, hot and stinging, mingled with the wind-driven dust on her face. She clutched the obsidian pendant. For them, the summit of Thunder Mesa was a wind-swept plateau, bare rocks scoured clean by centuries of storms. Lightning cracked across the sky, closer now, painting the world in blinding white and deep violet shadows. The wind screamed, a physical force that tore at Eliza's hair and clothes, trying to rip the tupu from her neck. Below, the townsfolk huddled near the mesa's edge, faces upturned, pale blobs in the erratic light. Judge Voss stood slightly apart, Sheriff Briggs beside him, both looking diminished against the elemental fury. Iron Shadow positioned Eliza at the very center of the plateau. "Face the storm's heart," he instructed, pointing west, where the cloud wall churned blackest. "Hold the truth. Speak what the wind shows." He stepped back, merging with the shadows near a jagged outcrop, a silent sentinel. Eliza stood alone, buffeted by the gale. Rain began to fall, cold, heavy drops stinging her skin. Lightning flashed again, and in its blinding afterimage, the vision struck. Not fragmented sensations, but a stark, horrifying scene. Silas Croft's study, lamplight flickering. Not an argument, but a demand. Croft, florid and sweating, slamming a ledger down on his desk, jabbing a finger at a figure seated opposite. The figure turned, Judge Harlan Voss, his face contorted with rage and fear. Voss yelling, "You fool the Quahati know. They found the rifles. They'll trace them back." Croft sneered, reaching into his drawer. "Then you'll take the fall with me, Harlan." A glint of steel, not a knife, but a derringer. Voss lunged across the desk, a desperate, clawing motion. A struggle, a deafening bang. Croft staggering back, clutching his chest, disbelief in his eyes. Voss panting, wild-eyed, grabbing Croft's silver money clip from the desk, then seeing movement outside the window. Eliza, drawn by the noise, her face illuminated in the lamplight. Panic. Voss dropping the money clip beside the horrified girl as she stumbled back into the blood. The vision vanished as thunder shook the mesa, a roar that vibrated in Eliza's bones. But the truth, the horrifying, undeniable truth, blazed within her. The wind tore at her, demanding voice. The silence shattered. It was him. Eliza screamed. The words ripped from her throat, raw and powerful, carried by the wind across the mesa. She pointed a trembling finger down toward the huddled figures, straight at Judge Harlan Voss. Voss! He shot Croft. Chaos erupted. Gasp shouts. Voss's face turned purple with rage and terror. Lies! The girl's mad. Savage witchcraft. He grabbed for Briggs's pistol. Shoot her. Shoot her now. But Briggs hesitated, staring at Eliza, then at his judge, the scales of his duty finally cracking under the weight of the storm and the girl's desperate accusation. At that moment, Abner Finch, emboldened by Eliza's cry or broken by his own fear, stumbled forward, waving a small leather-bound book. She speaks true. The ledger, Croft's ledger, it shows payments. Rifles, 50 repeating rifles sold to renegades through Judge Voss. Croft found out Voss double-crossed him, sold some to the Quahadi's enemies. They argued. I heard the shot. I saw Voss run. Voss howled, pure panic now. He wrenched Briggs's pistol free and swung it wildly, not at Eliza, but towards Finch. Traitor. Before he could fire, a blinding fork of lightning struck the mesa's highest point with a deafening crack, showering sparks and splitting the night. The concussion knocked Eliza off her feet. She fell hard, the obsidian pendant striking her cheek. The world dissolved into ringing silence and searing white light. The last thing she saw, through blurred vision, was iron shadows surging forward, not toward her, but toward the chaos below, his face a mask of fierce, protective fury. Then darkness swallowed her, the wind of reckoning howling its victory over the stunned town. Darkness wasn't empty. It pulsed with the afterimage of lightning, the echo of thunder and the raw, ragged sound of her own voice tearing free. It was him. Eliza drifted in a gray haze, the cool press of obsidian against her cheekbone the only anchor. Distantly, chaos roared. Shouts, a gunshot that seemed muffled, a scream cut short, the panicked whinny of horses, and beneath it all, the relentless howl of the wind slowly subsiding into a grieving moan. She surfaced with the smell of wet earth and crushed sage, a clean, sharp scent after the storm's metallic tang. Rain still fell, gentle now, cool drops kissing her face. She lay on rough ground, sheltered by the lee of Thunder Mesa's summit rocks. A figure knelt beside her, a solid silhouette against the bruised purple sky lightening in the east. Iron Shadow. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, the same grounding touch as before the trials. Little Sparrow. His voice was low, a rumble felt more than heard. The storm passes. Memory flooded back, the blinding vision in the lightning flash, Voss's snarling face, the ledger, the derringer, the desperate scramble, the blood. Her father, her mother, the river, Little Willow. The truth, scalding and absolute. She pushed herself up, wincing at the ache in her limbs, the tender spot on her cheek where the tuple pendant had struck. Her gaze darted past Iron Shadow. Below, on the mesa's lower slopes, a different kind of storm raged. Lanterns cast frantic pools of light. Sheriff Briggs, his face grim and resolute, had Judge Voss pinned face down in the mud, a knee in his back. Voss thrashed and spat curses. His fine robes ruined his wig askew. Unhand me, traitor. Savage lies. That girl is cursed. Finch is a thief. Abner Finch stood nearby, trembling but defiant, clutching the leather ledger to his chest like a shield. It's all here, Sheriff. Every payment. Rifles shipped to Smith & Sons. That's Voss's front. Croft found out Voss sold a badge to Red Hand's renegades. the ones raiding Quahati hunting grounds. They argued that night. I heard Croft threaten to expose him. Finch pointed a shaking finger at Voss. He shot him, panicked, saw Eliza outside and framed her. A small knot of townsfolk surrounded them. Widow Martha Claiborne, her face pale but determined, young Ben clinging to her skirts, eyes wide as saucers, a couple of miners who looked deeply unsettled. Jed Carter stood apart, arms crossed, his expression sour, muttering about savage influence, but making no move to intervene. The rest of the crowd seemed stunned into silence or had already fled back towards Bitter Creek. Briggs expertly bound Voss's wrists with rawhide cord. "Save it for the circuit judge, Harlan." Briggs growled, his voice thick with disgust. "You ain't judge and jury no more." He hauled the sputtering, incoherent man to his feet. Voss's eyes, wild and desperate, met Eliza's as Briggs marched him past the sheltered overhang. For a fleeting second, pure, venomous hatred contorted his features, then collapsed into abject terror. He knew it was over. Eliza didn't flinch. She met his gaze, the fear that paralyzed her for weeks now replaced by a cold, clear fury. The words came easier this time, stronger, carried on the rain-washed air. "You killed him. You tried to kill me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a reclaiming of her stolen narrative. Voss opened his mouth, perhaps to spew more vitriol, but Briggs jerked him forward. "Move." The sheriff's glance toward Eliza held a world of apology and newfound respect. He nodded curtly at Iron Shadow before leading his former boss, now his prisoner, down the treacherous slope towards the waking town. Silence descended, broken only by the soft patter of rain and the distant cry of a hawk greeting the dawn. Iron Shadow offered Eliza a hand. She took it, his strength steadying her as she stood. The braided leather cord with its obsidian stone felt warm against her skin, a tangible link to man who had been her shadow, her protector, the living memory of her parents' kindness. They would be proud, Iron Shadow said quietly, following her gaze toward the eastern horizon where the first streaks of gold and rose were bleeding into the indigo. "Thomas and Sarah Dawn, their courage lives in you, little sparrow." Eliza swallowed against the lump in her throat. The grief for her parents, buried deep beneath trauma and silence, rose fresh and sharp, but tempered now by connection. "You knew them," she whispered, her voice still raw but gaining strength. "You knew me before." "I knew the spirit they carried," Iron Shadow replied, his gaze fixed on the emerging dawn. "I saw it reflected in their daughter when the wind first whispered your name near Bitter Creek. I vowed then to watch, unseen, until the lies demanded the wind speak." He looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a profound depth. "The winds have spoken. The reckoning is done." They descended Thunder Mesa as the sun crested the horizon, painting the rain-slicked desert in hues of amber and emerald. The storm had scoured the air, leaving it crystalline. The scent of wet creosote and damp earth was overwhelmingly alive. As they approached Bitter Creek, the sight that greeted them was unexpected. A small group, Widow Claiborne, Ben, Abner Finch looking less terrified, and a handful of others, including the cantina owner where Eliza had worked, stood near the town well. They weren't cheering, but the hostility that had radiated before was gone, replaced by a wary curiosity and, in some eyes like Martha's, open relief. But it was the gallows that drew Eliza's gaze. Sheriff Briggs, with the help of two young men Eliza recognized as stable hands, wasn't preparing it. They were dismantling it, plank by heavy plank. The symbol of her impending death was being taken down. The raw timber lay scattered in the mud of the square, looking suddenly impotent, just dead under the cleansing dawn light. Briggs looked up as they approached, wiping sweat from his brow. He gave Eliza a curt, respectful nod. "Town won't be needing this particular piece of justice for a while, Miss Dawn. Circuit judge rides through next week. Finch's ledger and testimonial see Voss hang for what he done." He glanced at Iron Shadow, a complex mix of gratitude and lingering unease in his eyes. Obliged for setting things straight. Eliza didn't speak, but she met his gaze steadily. The fear was gone. She simply was. Present. Whole. Healed enough to stand in the truth. Widow Martha stepped forward, her eyes moist. Child, Eliza, come. You need rest. Proper food. You'll stay with me. It wasn't a question. It was an offering, a fragile bridge back into the community. Eliza looked at the kind widow, then at the scattered timbers of the gallows, then out towards the vast, rain-freshened desert stretching beyond the town. She felt the weight of the obsidian stone, warm against her skin. She looked up at Iron Shadow. His expression was serene, watchful. He had fulfilled his vow. My people move with a buffalo moon, he said softly, answering her unspoken question. The path is long. He placed a hand briefly over the tupu pendant she wore. This truth is yours now. Wear it. Remember, the desert holds your spirit, little sparrow. My fire is always open to Thomas Dawn's daughter. He didn't say goodbye. He simply turned, his movements fluid and silent, and walked toward the edge of town where his horse waited, a silhouette against the burgeoning light. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. His shadow had lifted, leaving her standing in her own dawn. Eliza watched him go, a figure as timeless as the mesas, merging with the golden landscape. A profound sense of peace, fragile but undeniable, settled over her. The silence within wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the whisper of wind, the memory of her parents' smiles, the echo of her own reclaimed voice, and the vast, open promise of the desert. She turned back to Widow Martha, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in living memory. The word felt right, solid, anchoring her to this new beginning. Yes. She placed her hand over the obsidian stone. I'll stay. For now. The future, like the desert horizon, stretched wide and unknown, but it was hers to walk, no longer silent, no longer afraid, beneath the cleansing sky of a justice hard one. The hawk that carried the first feather circled high above, alone, free speck against the endless blue.